But we haven't yet shown which religion, if any, are actually true. We've only said that not all religions can be true. So let's narrow it down further and now go to the next question: does God exist? And there are lots of different arguments for the existence of God. And before I get into that, I do want to re-emphasize that I'm making a cumulative case that God exists, just like I'm doing with this whole case about whether Christianity is true. So my argument for God's existence doesn't rely on just one argument alone, but looking at many different arguments and seeing in the end if it paints the picture of God existing or God not existing. Before I get into some of these arguments, I do want to mention something called Pascal's wager. Now, if you remember Pascal, he was a brilliant mathematician. Maybe you've heard of Pascal's triangle. That's another important thing this guy is known for. And what Pascal said in his wager is, if the evidence was 50-50 whether God exists or doesn't exist, it's better to place your bets that God does exist rather than not. Because betting on Christianity and that God exists is a much safer bet than betting that he doesn't exist. The reason for that is if you believe God does exist and it turns out he really doesn't, well, what have you missed out on? You've missed out on probably drinking all night and getting drunk and throwing up all the time. You don't just get to sleep with whoever you want to. Things that are more temporal pleasures, we have to maybe give up some of those. But in the end, you still have a great family who loves you. You can still be a very moral person. And you can still live a really great life, even if it turns out you're wrong and God doesn't exist after all. And on the plus side for eternity, you also have the hope of a life to come where you can live with God and enjoy Him forever. And you'll also be living with all the other people who have put their trust in God too. And that will never end, and it'll never get tired and never get old. I don't know about you, but this earth, even the pleasures here, those get old after a while. Can you imagine never getting tired of things and having an unending joy in heaven? That sounds like a pretty cool thing to bet on. But on the other hand, if you bet that God does not exist, and it turns out that you're wrong, well, that means that you're separated from God forever, and that cannot be undone. The time we have now is the time to respond to God. God's made the first move by putting breadcrumbs for us to find if we truly do want to seek Him. So Pascal basically says it's a better bet to bet on God than not. Now that's an interesting thought. I wouldn't necessarily call that evidence for God, but I just thought I'd note that because that is a popular thing that Pascal said, and I think there is some merit to that. My only pushback on Pascal would be that if God doesn't exist and the resurrection never happened, then Paul says Christians are to be pitied more than anybody else. Because even though Christians do have that hope, life is not a picnic, and there are some temporal pleasures that we set aside because we have this hope of something to come. So as I mentioned before, there are many arguments that God exists, and I can't list all of them, but some that I won't go into much detail is the argument from beauty. That's the idea of, well, if we're just molecules in motion, why do we appreciate things like beauty? Why does beauty even exist? The argument of contingency, that as human beings we didn't have to exist for everything else to be set in motion, but there does have to be something that is necessary to exist for everything to happen. The ontological argument, the transcendental argument, the argument from logic, and many more. And to sum up the three arguments that I'm going to really touch on in more detail, I can say three things really quickly. A universe that has a beginning implies a beginner. A universe that appears designed requires a designer, and a world that has a moral law requires a moral lawgiver.